Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth No Back to Normal Degrowth talk. Today's topic is the Green New Deal and the Political Economy of Degrowth. My name is Katja, and I'm joining from Tampere, Finland, and I feel a little bit nervous because this is my first YouTube live stream. I'm co-moderating the discussion tonight with Yefin. Yefin, where are you and how do you feel?
Yeah, hi, and welcome also from my side. I'm based on Leeds, which is where I'm living through this lockdown, which is still on here, and I'm doing well today. It's sunny outside. I'm inside though, and it's my housemate's birthday. So if she's watching this, happy birthday again. If there's any rowdy sounds coming from the background, that's why. Looking forward to this.
Very good. And you know, we have also off-screen support to make this talk as interactive as possible. So thank you very much, Eva, Gabi, and Lorenzo helping us out tonight. And then it's my great pleasure to welcome our three remarkable speakers. Stefania Barca is a senior researcher at the Center of Social Studies of the University of Coimbra, where she teaches political ecology and coordinates the Ecology and Society Lab. I'm glad to have you here, Stefania. From where are you joining us and how are you?
Thank you, Katja. I am very well, thank you. And I'm joining you from Sweden, from Stockholm.
We also have here with us Riccardo Mastini. Riccardo is a PhD candidate in ecological economics and political ecology in the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Ricardo, how are you today and where are you joining from?
Hi, Katja. I'm well and I'm joining from Barcelona, the first post-lockdown week in Barcelona. So very excited, but I prefer to be here with you than being outside enjoying the city. You can be sure of that.
Glad to hear that. And last but not least, we also have here Timothy Paris. Tim holds a PhD in economics from the Center for Development Studies and Research in University of Clermont Auvergne, France, and the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University, Sweden. How are you, Tim? And from where are you calling?
Hi, Katja. I'm very good. I'm calling from Versailles in France, and they just reopened the forest. So I just came back from the woods and makes me feel very happy.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. You know, I also love to go out when just possible. You appreciate it in a very different way now. So just to go back to what happened earlier, in the last three degrowth talks that we already had, we discussed many aspects of degrowth. In the first conversation, we discussed what degrowth is and where it came from. And in the second conversation, we heard perspectives from the majority world and how degrowth is linked with, and in some ways, also rooted to the ideas from the majority world. In last week's conversation, we made a deep dive into the tricky realm of money and finance. So in tonight's conversation, we will dream big and think clear. We will travel into the future and look at the utopia of degrowth, asking what mechanisms, what political economy would deliver the outcomes that we want to see in the degrowth future. And then we come back. We come back into the present with all the inspiration from the future and ask, how do we get there from where we are now? What bridges can we build between where we are now and where we want to go? So tonight's webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, and after the live streaming tonight, it will also be available on YouTube channel. And I would like to encourage all of you to join the discussion through the live chat or in Twitter. And hashtags #NoBackToNormal or Degrowth Talks will help us to pick up the thread there. And of course, Eva, Gabi, and Lorenzo will collect questions from the audience, which we will then ask from our speakers. However, before the question and answer part, which will come, we have asked our speakers to give short introductions to the topic of tonight. So, without further ado, let the talk begin. Our first speaker is Timothée Barry. Tim holds PhD in economics from the Center for Development Studies and Research in the University of Clermont, Auvergne, France, and the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University, Sweden. Titled The Political Economy of Degrowth, his dissertation explores the economic implications of the idea of degrowth. The floor is yours, Tim.
Thank you very much, Katja. So how to achieve degrowth? Small question. But my answer would be the key, the clock, and the coin, changing property, work, and money. These are the three fundamental institutions of capitalism, and so these are the three leverage points to escape capitalism. So let's dive in, get a slide. First one, inverted, property. So property defines what is a resource and who should be entitled to have it. All the written rules and informal customs we follow when we behave toward resources, this is property. And without property, there would be no economy. But when I say property though, I'm sure you're thinking private property. This is not a random association. We think private property because it has become the prevailing way of organizing ownership. But private property is only one out of 4 types of ownership. Private property owned by individual agent, like a person or a firm, think toothbrush. Common property owned by community, like an urban garden. Public property owned by the state, like a national park, or uncontrolled property owned by no one. Think about most forms of pollutions. What matters here is that property rules are never predetermined. They are social agreements, and so they can change in time and space. When workers run a recuperated factory, they socialize a private asset. When you pay taxes, the state nationalizes some of your private wealth. When corporations sell scientific articles, they privatize communal wealth. And when you throw away trash in the sea, you renounce property rights. Now, what I want to argue is that degrowth requires 3 changes concerning property. 1, redistribution of existing wealth. 2, distribution of future wealth. And 3, pre-distribution of potential wealth. Let me explain. The first problem is about private possessions. Some have a lot of it, others none. Classic solution, redistribute. There should be a minimum and maximum thresholds on the earning of income and the accumulation of wealth. Making sure no one has too much, for example, by capping income at 10 times the minimum wage and taxing personal wealth and inheritance, and ensuring that everyone has enough via universal basic income, universal basic services, or a mix of the two. The second problem concerns businesses, or rather, like, let's say production in general. When wealth is created through production, it is not fairly distributed among participants if most of it goes to shareholders. To change this, we need to do away with the profit motive, for example, by limiting the ability of companies to pay dividends to shareholders. And we also need to democratize governance, like it's being done in cooperatives, where employees can decide how much they should be paid. The third problem about pre-distribution concerns the allocation of property rights regarding certain assets such as land, natural resources, or knowledge. Here, the goal is to prevent both economic rents over the benefits, for example, abusive patenting, and the outsourcing of the burdens. So, for example, the negative property in the form of pollution today given to the poorest. This involves granting intrinsic rights to nature, for example, by having ecocide laws, managing resources as commons via, for example, seeds banks and peer-to-peer education, banning certain polluting activities like synthetic pesticides, capping others like carbon emissions, and taxing whatever you cannot ban and cap, for example, plastic. So to recap about property. Transforming property means redistributing the wealth that already exists, ensuring a fair split of the wealth that is being created, and preventing the private appropriation of social and environmental wealth. So now let's move to work. And the work question starts with this question. So what do you do? This question we ask all the time is a very deep question. For example, am I working right now talking to you? Capitalism says no, because I'm not being paid and I'm not generating any monetary wealth. But that's the problem. We prioritize commodity producing wage labor over all other activities. Degrowth requires a triple transformation of work concerning its quantity, how much time do we spend working, quality, what do we do when we work, and discourse, how do we feel about work as a society. Let's start with quantity. I don't like the term work time reduction. To be precise, we should speak of employment time reduction, because this reduction must be selective, not an overall reduction of human activity, that would be absurd, but liberating time for what we think matters. So maybe we should not talk of work time reduction, but of free time expansion. Reducing time spent in employment would be desirable for a number of reasons. I mean, think about sharing available jobs and reducing unemployment, or reducing resource use because GDP correlates with environmental pressures. And most importantly, to liberate time. And that's an important point. We cannot organize a new economy if we're all too busy working 50 hours a week, maintaining the old economy. Number two, degrowth should struggle for less work, but also for better work. Let's think about this. What kind of product, subject, and social relations do we want to create in the workplace? This has to do with the content of work. I would say that work should not detract from the common good. It should be socially useful and ecologically sustainable. And that undesirable work, the work that nobody wants to do, should be fairly distributed. But it also has to do with the form of work. Work should never degrade dignity. Work should be secure and fairly remunerated. And work should be democratic. Employees should exercise individual and collective autonomy in the workplace. Third aspect, more important than less work and better work, we need to redefine what work is and the role it should play in society. This is the idea of post-work. Let us stop worshipping commodity producing wage labor and start evaluating human activities outside of the realm of economic rationality. And this implies a number of things. First of all, emancipating from the work ethic, the one that says that working is inherently good, regardless of what the work is about. Work should be concrete. It should satisfy needs, not detract from them. Ultimately, the purpose of economic organization is to economize time, which means liberating as many hours as possible from activities you're not too excited about for activities you're excited about. So this is not only about work, it's about time. Post-work means to be able to choose the quantity and quality of work, and by doing so to regain autonomy over the use of our time. It is a politicization of time. In summary, transforming work means working less, work time reduction, in better condition, decent work, and reducing the importance of work in society. That's post-work. Final institution, money. So money, the question with money is, should we transform money or abolish money? I say we should transform money in order to abolish money making. Modern money is problematic for three reasons. It takes the form of a general purpose currency. It is created as debt by for-profit commercial banks, and it circulates pretty much unregulated in a for-profit financial environment. So let's tackle the first problem. The problem with general purpose money is that it allows commensurability between things that should not be otherwise connected? Look at this bill. This bill is both 1/3 of a barrel of oil, 3 kilos of tomatoes, and 74 minutes of labor at French minimum wage. We cannot have an economy that is diverse with only one single measure of value. Diverse economies need diverse monies in the plural. So imagine a monetary ecosystem like a food chain with local exchange trading schemes and time banks at the village level, convertible local currencies at the regional level, a national currency, and maybe even supranational currencies. Some of these currencies can be backed by time, other by carbon, other by nothing. But they should all be democratically designed and managed by the users. Monetary diversity is a way to re-embed economic activities in social and moral values as to make sure that purchasing power doesn't turn into pulverizing power. For example, alternative currency can relocalize production and consumption and stimulate non-market activities. They can be used to organize forms of reciprocity, redistribution, and sharing that can substitute to market exchange, like this time currency in Japan that is used for elderly care and that we wish we had during the pandemic in France. Second problem, money is controlled by commercial banks. So we need to decommodify money, no way around that. Money is commodified because it is created by private banks following a profit motive. This ceases to be so in a local currency where money is created by an association with a mission of social benefit. Same case for a sovereign money system. It is a central bank-like institution that decides politically of the quantity of money to be issued. Money becomes a public good open to democratic deliberation. Final problem. There is too much money in the financial sector. It's not surprising. In a profit-driven market economy, money finds the most lucrative opportunities. Today, that's in finance. Like a giant magnet, finance is attracting money, which is then not available to invest in less profitable sectors like care activities, education, and clean energy. The issue is that the financial sphere is disproportionately large and fast, and so it destabilizes the rest of the economy. The goal then is to slow down and shrink down finance, slow and small finance. The financial sphere must remain in par with the real economy, itself in par with supporting social and ecological systems, like a tree, where branches should be sized to the trunk and the roots. So let's recap. Transforming money means challenging the hegemony of general purpose money in favor of monetary diversity. Taking back control over monetary governance and shrinking down and slowing down the financial sphere. So these are the changes I envision to achieve degrowth, but maybe I should wrap up here. What I've been trying to argue in this presentation is that degrowth is not only a slogan, a social movement, or even a worldview. It could also be an alternative economic system. For this, we need to challenge three hegemonies: private property, wage labor, general purpose money. These are the three that came to my mind, but I'm sure there are many more. What matters is to keep in mind that the economy is an invention. It is a game we play with rules we make. It's nothing but a bundle of institutions. Institutions that have been socially constructed and can therefore be socially deconstructed and reconstructed at will. And if the economy is political, then it means that we are all economists. And my message to you, my fellow economist, is this: time to stop predicting the future of the economy and start inventing the economy of the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. That was excellent. And I had a little bit of a read through your PhD dissertation, which, by the way, is also absolutely excellent. So everyone should read it. It's a good 800 pages. So it's a little weekend, weekend reading exercise. So that there you quote the famous Emma Goldman quote, or you slightly adapt it and you say, like, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your economy. And I, for one, would definitely want to be part of your economy and dance to those tunes of a new story of what it means to be human, ultimately. So thanks again, Tim. Now you can probably tell that we haven't quite reached the happy end of our webinar yet, because here's the rub: that hopeful future that Tim just so colorfully painted isn't precisely around the corner, is it? And it's not just going to happen to us. We will very actively need to bring it here. As Katja said earlier, there's this daunting canyon between our broken system now and the future that we want, that Tim just painted for us. And to cross that canyon, we will need one hell of a bridge. We will need to anchor it firmly in the political, economic, and cultural ground that we stand on in the here and now. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us here today some world-class engineers. Of course, not conventional engineers, but engineers of the social transition, engineers of the new economy, political economists, ecological economists, and political ecologists that work on the transition. And our next speaker is certainly one of them, a thinker and a shaper, a maker and a shaker of the transition. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Riccardo Mastini. Ricardo, as we've heard, is a PhD candidate in ecological economics and political ecology at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, ICTA, at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And he's also a member of the academic collective Research and Degrowth, of the international network Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and of the editorial team of the web portal Degrowth.info. He's a policy advisor for the international campaign Green New Deal for Europe, and he's previously worked as a campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe. We're really delighted to have you here tonight, Ricardo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yefim, for the introduction. And I'd like also to thank all the organizers of the Degrowth Talk series, because I think it's been a great success, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today. The claim that I'm trying to defend in my talk is that the Green New Deal can represent a transitional program towards degrowth. I use the term transitional program in a Trotskyist sense, meaning an agitational demand with the aim of linking the current situation to progress towards a political goal. Transitional demands call for primarily economic reforms that in theory could be achieved under capitalism, but that political and economic elites are unwilling to offer. Therefore, any progress towards obtaining a transitional demand is likely to weaken capitalism and strengthen the hand of the working class. The institutional changes called for by Green New Deal advocates may appear reformist compared with the utopian vision of growth, but they are extremely radical if compared with where things currently stand. Hence, to use a term coined by André Gortz, one of the founding figures of degrowth, we may call these proposals non-reformist reforms, meaning reforms that, if they were to be implemented, would require the contours of the system to change radically to accommodate them, and reforms that, simple and commonsensical as they are, expose the irrationality of a system that makes them seem impossible. But what does the Green New Deal exactly stand for? Climate justice activists who have coined this political slogan take the view that the ecological crisis is part of a wider social crisis caused by unbridled capitalism. Hence, we should aim to solve it not through market mechanisms, but rather by redistributing economic and political power. This is why equating the Green New Deal merely with the decarbonization of infrastructural and productive system misses the point. While such technological overhaul is surely necessary and part of any degrowth vision, this does not seem to me much of a transitional program. After all, capital needs investment in basic infrastructure for sustaining the accumulation process, and a very large-scale transition to renewable energy could clearly constitute a special fix to the current situation of capitalist crisis. A transitional program would need to be something more than that. Hence, the investment program in green infrastructure would need to be the first step in a more ambitious political attempt to promote a different idea of value. This brings me to the point that merely investing in infrastructural change does not necessarily imply major institutional change. Indeed, what is lacking in most of today's political discourses is an idea of active investment for societal change. For instance, the creation of the welfare state meant exactly this. It did not mean upholding an economic growth strategy, but rather actively transforming society in the direction of a political vision. And the ecological transition should be seen in similar terms. The challenge is then to reclaim the idea of investment. And by investment here, I mean a common and coordinated commitment of resources, be they material, financial, or organizational, towards a long-term transformation and not profit-making. The rationale behind government investment can therefore be understood in two different ways. In the first interpretation, it can be seen as the role of government to make economically viable investments that are not done by the private sector because of prevailing uncertainty, which discourages investment. In the second interpretation, instead, the role of government can be seen to make investments which are viable by social criteria. To understand this distinction, it is important to differentiate between economic value and social value. Being valuable in social form is highly different from being valuable in commodity form or having exchange value. Hence, social investment should not mean only a long-termist strategy for creating more economic value, but rather a strategy for adding social value regardless of economic outcomes. This makes all of the difference because it would allow for public investments to be used to direct concrete needs rather than to boost the GDP growth. But since social returns do not necessarily materialize as economic returns, a crucial question to be asked is whether government needs to get its money back from a growing economy to pay for its investment. From the viewpoint of the mainstream interpretation of Keynesianism and the idea of stimulus, this is self-evidently the case. But given that the Green New Deal discourse takes insights from modern monetary theory, its advocates reject the constraints imposed by the obsession with a balanced budget, in which government's revenues needs to be equal to expenditure. But if we argue that investment can be used to create social transformation regardless of economic returns, then one condition has to apply. The government has to be able to finance its investment without reliance on tax income. Indeed, if a government needs to keep financing itself via taxes, it has to eventually balance its budget and also have an income stream from taxation, implying an expanding capitalist economy. If we reject this notion, as Green New Deal advocates do, then we have to take the critical position that economic reality is always fully political, meaning that public funding can always be organized to meet preferred goals if the political will exists to create a new vision for society. In planning public investments, money as such is never a scarce resource. Governments need to spend, as Keynes recommended in World War II, without limit and to complete a task. The point that money as such is never a scarce resource needs to be understood correctly, though. It does not mean that money could be produced by the government limitlessly without problems, but rather that the creation of new money in a currency sovereign country can be controlled by the government rather than by the banking sector. By regaining control over government funding from the international financial markets, social objectives can be pursued even against capitalist interests. The question that a government should then ask when going about the Green New Deal is not, can we afford it, but rather, will it be inflationary? If the answer is yes, then the government must find a way of withdrawing money from the economy through a variety of policies, such as cutting other public expenditures, for instance, on fossil fuel subsidies or on armaments, and by increasing taxes, for instance, by steeper progressive taxation on the top 1%. In the case of these two examples, meaning removing fossil fuel subsidies and increasing top marginal taxation, it would imply that the Green New Deal is going to be indirectly paid by the wealthy, given the loss in market value for big oil and the increasing taxation. At this point, you may wonder if I think that the Green New Deal is the answer to all our prayers, and therefore we can just sit back and let the political slogan do all the work to get us to a degrowth utopia. Of course, I don't think so. I believe that the Green New Deal is a contested concept. It is a battlefield, and its meaning and ambition will be the result of the struggle waged by social movements. Therefore, my call to the degrowth community is not to accept it acritically or to reject it, but rather to hijack it. After all, what else is there? The point I want to make is that, like its namesake before it, the Green New Deal is a social compromise in the true sense of the term. Like Roosevelt's New Deal, it is a product of and a response to class struggle. Decades of environmentally conscious class struggle have brought us here. Decades more will be needed to get us to where we need to be. In the meantime, we need to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts in our heads at once. First, that as the most promising piece of social and environmental legislation, the Green New Deal is worth fighting for. Second, that should it be watered down the way that the European Green Deal has been, for instance, it might just result in new rounds of primitive accumulation and further commodification of nature. Our goal should then be to push its proposals and the excitement surrounding it in a revolutionary direction. But to do this, we must understand and address state power. I believe we have to reject the fantasy that an enlightened state can save us from climate catastrophe, a fantasy that discourages us from taking the radical actions that are, in fact, a prerequisite for the state doing anything at all. We must therefore reject the temptation of projecting our collective capacities in alienated form onto the state. We should adopt a stance of critical support, embracing the political openings afforded by the Green New Deal, while at the same time contesting some of its specific elements, hence pushing up against and expanding the horizon of political possibility. Rather than taking refuge in negation, we must grapple head-on with a complex strategic dilemma. The challenge of simultaneously confronting the fractions of capital and their many allies in the state who will fight most ruthlessly to preserve fossil capital, and the challenge of radicalizing the politics of the Green New Deal beyond its current limitations. To do this, we need both extra-parliamentary disruptive action from below, for example, taking inspiration from Extinction Rebellion and the global youth climate strikes, but also creative experimentation with policies and institutions. We have to bear in mind that the state can act autonomously and discipline capital if the state's elite personnel feels threatened. Therefore, social movements must target political elites and make them feel threatened enough to exercise the state's relative autonomy to capital's short-term prerogatives. But to do this, we need to place the state front and center in our strategic considerations. Appeals to corporate social responsibility, attempts to shame capital into reform, strategies that declare politics broken and seek to circumvent the state, or escapist hyperlocalism are fundamentally unrealistic. The battles to come have the potential to unleash desires and transform identities. We will learn, screw up, and learn again. The Green New Deal does not offer a prepackaged solution, but rather it opens up of a new terrain of politics. And what I say to the degrowth community is, let's seize it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ricardo. That was really interesting. It seems to me like we are already on the way. We just have to keep moving and learn and iterate on the way. That's the path to take. And next, Stefania Barca will give us a more in-depth introduction to one of the core pillars of the Green New Deal Europe. She will talk about a concept of care income. Stefania is a senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra, where she teaches political ecology and coordinates Ecology and Society Lab. She has a PhD in economic history and is the author of 3 books and a number of peer-reviewed articles in the environment labor nexus in the industrial era. She has co-edited the collection Towards a Political Economy of Degrowth. She is a coalition council member of the Green New Deal for Europe and is currently engaged with the Care Income Now campaign. I look forward to hearing more about that, Stefania. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Katia, and thanks to the speakers who have preceded me for laying out such clear arguments about the Green New Deal and the political economy of degrowth. As you were saying, Katia, I, together with Ricardo, I have been participating in the formulation of this document called A Blueprint for Europe's Just Transition, which is a 90 pages document where you can find online, and that lays out the core ideas, and also not only the ideas and principles that Ricardo explained so well, but also some concrete proposals on what a Green New Deal could look like in Europe. And as he was saying, the idea is not to formulate a top-down plan to implement at the state level, but a platform for social movements to mobilize and to also to make their own and to resonate with the struggles that already a number of different social movements are already bringing about in Europe. And one of these, the one I want to talk about today, is the feminist anti-capitalist struggles. And by this, I mean feminist movements like Ni Una Menos and the Global Women's Strike, and movements that have been raising the issue of social reproduction and why and how important social reproduction is in society and for the economy, and what this means in terms of rethinking the economy, because this has become central also to degrowth conversations. As you may be aware of, degrowth thought has already incorporated much of this feminist thought about social reproduction. So this is why talking about and working on the blueprint for the Green New Deal, we were very happy, particularly happy, of coming to work with two activists, long-term activists from the Global Women's Strike and Women of Color movement. That is Selma James and Nina Lopez, that approached our group while we were working on the Green New Deal, because there was a call for contributing to the document through a very open and transparent process, and they asked to contribute because they thought this was relevant to feminist struggles. And so together with them, we started to think about this proposal of a care income, by which we mean a compensation, both direct and indirect, for that work that is unpaid, and that nevertheless it is necessary to sustain life and social well-being. And this is those activities that are unpaid activities that are still predominantly performed by women, and that are that kind of work that is involved with the reproduction and care for people, for in the domestic sphere, but also for people at the community level and for the environment, by meaning both the urban environment and the rural environment. So all this unpaid work that goes into caring for people and for the environment must be somehow recognized, but not only on the symbolic level, but also on the material level. This is the proposal of a care income. And this has profound meanings, implications for rethinking of the economy, because of course this intersects with a number of things that were also mentioned by the speakers before me, like, for example, work. What meaning do we give to work, how we redefine work, and with money, how we use money to compensate for what kind of work, and by which kind of money politics, of monetary politics. These things are certainly involved with the institution of a care income. We were coming from different walks of life, let's say, but we were working together on this idea because we thought that this care income would be instrumental towards also not only social justice and gender justice, but also towards environmental justice. Because we shared this idea that environmental injustice is based on the devaluation or non-valuation of social reproduction work, of reproduction work, not only social, but all reproductive work is undervalued in the current system that threatens life, basically, no? And as Titi Bhattacharya says, life making versus death making. We currently have an economy that values death more than life, and death making more than life making, and this has to change. And the care income is, in our view, is a way to change that. But the proposal for a care income campaign, then COVID happened. No, the proposal was developed in the months before the pandemic. But then COVID happens, and COVID made it abundantly even more clear how essential care work and reproductive work are in society. And not only that, but how undervalued and threatened they are by the current political economic system that we have. So it is here that the idea arose from the global women's strike movement, to which Selma James and Nina Lopez belong, to start a campaign specifically addressing this care income aspect of the Green New Deal, a campaign that's called Care Income Now, through a letter addressed to governments all over the world, so not just in Europe, but in all countries. And the letter is already available in several languages, and yet more languages translations are under preparation, asking these governments to finally recognize this principle that care work, not only for people but also for the environment, is the kind of work that needs to be at the center of our economic system and needs to be properly compensated and rewarded also, because the people who, statistically speaking, the people who are more involved in this kind of unpaid work are also the more socially disadvantaged people. So not only women, but also women in disadvantaged social groups like women of color, migrant women, and women with disabilities, and these are. There is a recent report from Oxfam on care work that just released a few months ago that proves exactly that, with a number of data on the global level. So the care income has this let's say, this dual aim, that are, of course, two aims that are connected to each other: an aim to addressing one of the biggest economic and social inequalities on the global level, and injustices on the global level, the lack of remuneration for unpaid care work that falls as a burden on the shoulders of specific groups of people more than others, unequally. And on the other side of by recognizing and compensating this work, which is an enormous amount of work. The United Nations have estimated that if compensated, this work would amount to more than $10 trillion a year, globally speaking. So rewarding this work would mean to completely rethink the economy, work, and money specifically. So one of the most important, let's say, innovations of the care income proposal was the idea that care work is not only what once we used to term domestic work, even though this idea, the idea of social reproduction and social reproduction theory, comes from there. We should acknowledge the fact that we're having this conversation today because something like 40 years ago, the Wages for Housework campaign started to, and the domestic labor debate even before that, started to question the fact that domestic work was naturalized, was not considered as work, was considered as a natural activity that naturally belonged to women as such. And so these things have been long questioned by the feminist movement, especially by the radical anti-capitalist feminist movement, and by the women, the global, particularly the global women's strike, who has continued along all those years to lobby and to struggle for along this line. But the new thing now is an awareness through the ecofeminist movement, the environmental justice movement, which, by the way, are predominantly led by women, and this is also something that is well known. And also, these movements are also for environmental justice have a very clear perception of how the current capitalist system and extractive economy hurt certain people much harder than others. And the people that are hurt are basically the same, who also have are also carrying the burden of care work on their shoulders. So these are the same people. So there is a connection here that we now see and we now understand of the importance of care work, not only in terms of producing, of reproducing labor power, the worker who then goes to work for capital, because this was part of the domestic work, the understanding of domestic work. But it's not just about that. It's that care work reproduces also communities, and it's essential to marginalized and vulnerable populations to go by, to make a living, to reproduce themselves, and it is also essential work when it is performed in the urban environment and the rural environment. And here the ecofeminist movement has shown the importance of what we could call earth care work. The work, for example, that is spent in subsistence farming and the production of food. And the agroecology, the practice of agroecology, by which we could understand all non-industrial agriculture that is performed, still very important. It produces still a very important share of food production in the world. It feeds, still feeds a lot of people. And this is work done also predominantly by women. And it is there is, like in domestic work, there is a certain amount of this work that cannot be compensated, is not compensated by the market price of food, because otherwise food would, if we should have to compensate for all the work of preserving soils, saving water, saving seeds, and practicing labor-intensive agriculture, then the price of food would be unsustainable. So, of course, there is here a huge amount of work which is unpaid, and it is care work. It's work of it's caring for the reproduction of the ecosystems and all the resources that make the production of food possible. So this was just to give you an example of one important aspect of why the Care Income campaign is so central and fundamental to a Green New Deal. It resonates with the things that also Tim was mentioning, with the need of rethinking what is, and also Ricardo, the need to think what is really valuable in the economy and what must be consequently valued. And I stop here.
Thank you, Stefania. I believe with this, we now have an excellent basis to start the discussion. But before asking you any questions, I would like to give all of our speakers the opportunity to briefly comment to each other's inputs. Who would like to start?
I'll take then the
Please.
opportunity of expressing, yes, my agreement with both what Stefania and Tim said about work, and I think it weighs well into the distinction I was making between social and economic value, and so that work should not detract from the common good, and it should be socially useful and ecological sustainable, as they were arguing. And I think that this is well in line with one of the cornerstone proposals of the Green New Deal, which is a job guarantee, which is the opportunity to create work outside the market logic. So the idea is that the state can fund employment that is targeted at addressing concrete needs rather than just creating market value, since the private sector is instead is captured by this imperative. And I think then that there is a very important parallelism between the job guarantee and the argument they were making on employment. But I think this can also be applied to another aspect that Tim brought up, which was the idea of basic services and gratuity being another cornerstone of the growth. And I think that also this resonates well with the Green New Deal discourse, which posits that climate change is class struggle in the sense that it forces us to rethink the material conditions of everyday life. So how we move, what we eat, how we supply energy and the heating to our homes, and that the decarbonization of these basic services should entail their decommodification, so removing them from the market logic and subjecting them to the logic of the commons. And of course, a prerequisite for doing this is the socialization of private utilities so that they can be run by a social logic rather than just profit maximization. And this is another of the main cause, political cause of the Green New Deal.
Thank you, Ricardo. And Tim, please.
Yes, well, I disagree with every single statement spoken by these two lunatics, obviously. No, I think we're pretty much in agreement here. Maybe just to start the discussion, I'm going to point to two things. Historically, the universal basic income was the first degrowth policy, because when the term was coined in 2002 as décroissance durable, in the same special edition where they coined the term, there was an article explaining how the basic income was the key pillar of degrowth. That was 2002. And I feel we haven't moved much in terms of specifying what kind of basic income for degrowth. So now, if we go for the care income, which of course I completely agree with, there is quite a task in policy design. How big, given in what type of currency, to whom, where, financed, how. It is really this design that is not only going to make, I think, the policy convincing, but that is going to, make this particular proposal pregnant with an alternative economy. And then I can bounce back to something Ricardo talked about with the Green New Deal. And for me, I like to think in terms of Trojan horse policies. So for example, in France, there's a radical job guarantee experiment that is very anti-capitalist, which objective is to democratize the governance of the economy, is to completely redesign the notion of value pretty much what we understand by degrowth. But the way they sold it to the government so that the government could finance the experiment is just to say, well, it's a job guarantee. It cures unemployment. And it does. That's true. But it is, let's say there's more in the policy that you can see. So here I'm thinking about linking the two. Actually, when we're thinking about a job guarantee, how to link in the French case, I would say there is little difference between the job guarantee that is currently being experimented and the care income that Stefania talks about, because most of the person participating in the scheme are women that were currently unpaid in attending the care task that they thought were important in the community, and finally through this institution that allow them to make their occupation, their care occupation, a proper job and to be paid for it, we go in redefining value. From the government perspective, from the mainstream perspective, we call it employment, but us, we're calling it a revolutionary redefinition of labor. So that's the task ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tim. What are your thoughts about that, Stefania?
Well, first of all, that's very interesting, Tim. I didn't know about that, so we should talk more about that. And yes, I think that you're right. When we talk about care income, we are talking about a policy of full employment. In fact, in the Green New Deal, this is where the care income proposal fits. It fits in a package that is called Green Public Works. So it is intended not as much as a universal basic income, but more like a job, like recognizing that there is already this is already work that is being performed, only it is not paid. So paying this work would mean actually to create new employment. Paid employment where it is already that already exists. So this is the idea. So without creating new jobs in sectors that then would hurt the environment and the reproduction of humans and the biosphere. So but actually on the opposite, by rethinking employment in terms of what is really needed and what is really valuable. No? And this links to one of the points that that you were making before about one of your three pillars of a degrowth, political economy of degrowth, that was work. And I mostly agree with your vision of rethinking work in terms of emancipating ourselves from the work ethic and politicizing time, so buying time from waged work and reducing the importance of work in society overall. But you also said, I found this a little bit contradictory with what you also said, that the problem is not working. The problem is redefining what is work. I think this is actually more important than reducing work time, because what we really need is to consider certain activities as work. And in fact, to say it with a slogan, and if you're interested, you can find this in my chapter in the book, The Political Economy of Degrowth. We not only need a liberation from work, we need a liberation of work itself, even waged work. We need it to be more autonomous from capital and more and able to produce a social metabolism that doesn't hurt the environment.
Thank you, Stefania. There's already loads of comments coming in on YouTube and Twitter, and that's brilliant. So please keep sending us your questions, and we will address them throughout the rest of the discussion. One question to kick us off that we won't get around, and Stefania has already quickly mentioned, is of course COVID-19. So I'd like to ask our speakers, how do you evaluate the current situation of crisis, with the window of opportunity probably more open for change than any time before in the last decades or whatever, and that can be changed, I guess, either for the better or for worse. So do you think the wind of change blows in favor of a degrowth transition? And maybe what kind of policies, initiatives, narratives maybe could be that are kind of in line with degrowth, could be particularly popular and resonate with people in light of what they're experiencing now in the crisis?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, please.
All right. Okay, well, I think that the pandemic has somehow brought home the point to many people that the economy is a social construction and that we can deconstruct it. I mean, we have seen this during the pandemic, certain measures that were completely unthinkable just 2 weeks before the lockdown started have been seized by governments around Europe and around the world. And I think that, of course, while we should push back the idea that the lockdown is degrowth, at the same time, I think there is an interesting parallelism we can build on, and is that when we realize that activities that threaten well-being should be stopped regardless of the impact that they will have on the economy. The idea is to set some safe limits, operational safe limits for society. In the case of the pandemic, was stay home. You just had to pursue physical distancing. And in the case of degrowth, it would be, for example, to capping emissions, keeping global warming to below 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial level. And so the idea is that you set a hard limits and then you reinvent the economy to make it work within those limits. And of course, as when this crisis strike, we should have ideas ready for that, because when this happens, it's the ideas that are laying around that we will reach out for. So we should be prepared. We should do our homeworks and create ideas, hammer them out with details, as Tim was calling out, and discuss them in society and have them ready for when this kind of situations occur. And I think that this can be a learning lesson for degrowth.
There's that famous quote by
Milton Friedman.
Milton
Yes.
Friedman. I was just going to say, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Any thoughts on this from Tim or Stefania on the situation with COVID?
Do you want to go first, Stefania?
Tim, please go first.
Okay. I think this is an opportunity. I mean, imagine you're playing Monopoly, and all of a sudden, one of the player has a stroke, and we also start caring for that person. This is basically what happened, and in doing this for one of the first time since really in the history of modern capitalism, we can step back and look at the game from the outside. And now we're being confronted not only with the realization that, well, the economy is a game, so this kind of, it's political. We have made the rules of economy, but we've also confronted with the decision of like, should we get back playing with the same rules, or should we change something? Huge opportunity. And I think some of the creativity in terms of policies that we've witnessed in the last month, at least in Europe, is just, it's making me quite optimistic, because some policy instruments that have always been considered absolute wizardry are now just suddenly on the table. So I think again, it's a design issue. So now, as you may have seen, France has guaranteed partial employment to the entirety of private employees. That is unprecedented. That is huge. But again, are we back in this kind of full employment, like people that the care work that we're talking about, task of reproduction, or not? It's not being remunerated. It's again partial employment to the people employed in commodity production. So I think our opportunity is to get into the design of these policies and to say, well, basic income, yes, but in the form of a care income. Maybe like, monetary injection, yes, but in the form of debt monetization rather than just helicopter money or just quantitative easing. And every time sees an opportunity to build the hell of a bridge that you were talking about. The second thing I want to say, so that's the optimist. The pessimist is, so now that's a projected 8% negative GDP for 2020 in the Eurozone. I mean, in France, it's also like, it's a bit more, so 8.6, I think. It has never been that low since 1876. And in a society with a very strong ideology of growthism, this sounds like your most absolute nightmare. So what this shows us is that we have an opportunity, but we need to play our cards right. Now I've been solicited a lot by people interested in the idea of degrowth. And I think now the term degrowth must not be associated with this deep recession, but actually rather phrasing it as finding a way to become independent from, GDP and the specific state of the economy. So that involves, like when I was talking about like Trojan policies and the way we design transition strategies, to be really smart and pragmatic on how to get there and accommodate for a diversity of political worldviews.
Thank you. Stefania, anything to add?
Yes, well, I agree. This is a great opportunity, even though it sounds really weird to say so, considering the amount of people who have died. But of course, if you see it from, if you just focus on the, the economic aspect, to what Tim was mentioning, that we're going towards a situation of negative GDP, very, very low. This is an unprecedented opportunity to say that we need to drop GDP growth as a measure of wealth, because otherwise we're going to go through a terrible crisis. and this is going to hit people very, very badly. So this is the moment in which it is really, it has become really possible to talk about, to pressure towards really dropping GDP growth and replacing it with something else. And of course, the degrowth movement, so to speak, has now several years, if not decades, of thinking and practicing also alternatives. So this is the moment for the movement to really become bold and come up with all these alternative ideas and make them sound as realistic as possible. So I would say this is the time to really invent a new realism. We have lived through capitalist realism in the last 3 decades, and in these decades we have been repeatedly, and everybody has been convinced that there is no alternative. So this is the moment, this COVID crisis, it's like a shock that might turn it clear and evident that that what we need is precisely an alternative. So and so alternatives might sound the most realistic answer to the crisis. But coming to in practice, what this means in practice, it means that we really need to do a lot of work to bring these conversations and bring these ideas and these alternatives down to the ground. I mean, in the sense out of the bubble, let's say, out of the academic bubble or the radical social movement bubble, which is not a bad bubble. I mean, I don't think it's the problem is that we are. I don't think we are completely detached from society and we are useless. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is that what we have talking about and practicing has definitely to reach out to people who haven't had the opportunity of being part of this conversation so far. And here I'm thinking specifically, for example, to the trade unions, the labor movements, left parties, and people who vote for those parties, and people who identify with left politics, which is a very small minority nowadays. But not only that, let's talk bigger. Let's talk about in terms of working class people in general. And we know that today, many working class people actually vote for the far right or for the right, and for this new right that is representing, is claiming to represent working class interests nowadays. So I think that is a real challenge for the degrowth movement now to address. And another challenge, sticking with the care income campaign, the challenge I have been experiencing mostly with this campaign is the resistance from within the feminist movement itself, and not only from the feminist movement, but also from the universal basic income movement. So these two movements that are those most touched upon by the care income campaign are also resisting, opposing their own, let's say, old proposals. No, in the case of the universal basic income, the fact that this has this character of universality of this income that does not relate to the kinds of work that are actually needed in society, that does not formulate that question: what kind of work do we really need? And in the case of the feminist movement, it's more like a claim for women's for equal opportunities, again without questioning opportunities to do what, in what kind of system, and with what impact upon society and upon the environment. So I am facing the challenge of kind of changing the concepts, changing the language and the thinking from within this movement. But at the same time, I think that in society at large, the care income does really resonate with demands for justice from a lot of people who do unpaid care work and are able to grasp and understand what is at stake here.
Thank you. I mean, we could go on and on. I'd like to now start with some of the questions that are coming in from our audience, and I think this one is very interesting. It goes like this. It seems that the state is suggested as the main actor and scale for the Green New Deal and redistribution. Don't we need to change our conceptualization of the state? How about local co-op societies that can pool resources and meet basic needs? Perhaps maybe Ricardo, you could try with that.
Right, sure. Yes, I totally agree with it. I think there should be different levels of governance, and I think it should be decentralized. I feel like coming into this talk that I wanted to push the degrowth community to get out of some hyper-localism, which has been one of its main traits historically. And I think that now we should engage with the climate justice movement, that especially the Anglo-Saxon environmental justice movement that has set its sight on the state. And I think that over the past 30 years with neoliberalism, there has been a long wave in which we have thought that we could just organize networks within civil society or local co-ops and we could just ignore the state to death. Whereas I think that we have to be mindful that if we don't control the state, the enemy does. And we should be mindful of the fact that while institutions surely carry some path dependency, they are not monolithic. And looking at Gramscian thinking of hegemony and common sense, we should try to exploit the cracks that always exist within institutions to try and advance new common sense. So I do not at all think that we should just revert to some sort of state socialism project and forgetting how the ecological question inevitably forces us to think in local terms. But at the same time, we cannot ignore national politics, because while there are all these sproutings of utopia all around, co-ops and all kinds of commons, at the same time, we need the canopy somehow of the state to protect these sproutings from thunderstorms, from financial markets and from the ravaging power that financial economic elites can have. So I think we should, as I was saying in my opening remarks, try to hold two contradictory thoughts at once in our heads. And this is the kind of contradictory thought I think we should embrace. Operate at all levels of governance and not ignore any of them. The solution is neither at the state level nor at the super local level. It's in the interlocution between these two levels.
Thanks, Accardo. And the next question will actually sort of follow up on that, because one policy that both you and Tim have mentioned is this idea of redistribution and for example, a wealth tax. And one question that we got, and I would maybe address it first to Tim, is how to respond to the resistance that will rise against these radical redistribution schemes, and not just by the 1%. Tim, any thoughts?
Truth is, I don't know, it puzzles me. Like in France, we have many surveys that shows that the people opposing more larger inheritance taxation are the people that would benefit from them, while the richest people that would actually have to pay more taxes on their inheritance are the ones that agree. So I think there is this common sense of expecting ourselves to be rich in the future, which is a big part of the ideology of growth. And so far we are all considering ourselves, or at least in this kind of like middle class, like potential rich people. And somehow we're defending the interest of the wealthy, even though we're not in the class, but like waiting for keeping the potential option of just being there. So that is puzzling. On the other hand, I mean, not all taxes are resisted. So inheritance taxation, very sensitive, not the place to start, but personal wealth tax, the one that was removed in France 2 years ago, that started the Yellow Vest movement. The Yellow Vest was not about the carbon tax. The carbon tax was really the match, but it was about the removal of a personal wealth tax that had been one of the symbols of solidarity in France. And I think now people are talking about, bringing it back, calling it the coronavirus tax. And it seems like we could build a large support around this. So we really need to ask ourselves very strategically, which wealth to start with. Another good example is the maximum wage. The maximum wage has a broader support than even wealth taxation. So that could be also a way to start, a small way to start, because of course, income inequality is quite small compared to wealth inequality. So we will have to touch about wealth. But perhaps, one is good to start with. You start with the maximum wage, and then, with the same logic, you go to something else. Like, for example, arguing, guys, so we've had this, we've decided to have this corona tax because, we think rich people should, they have a responsibility with the purchasing power they have to contribute to, assisting ourselves in facing the crisis. What about, this logic could apply to climate change too? And then, that can introduce another degree of taxation, and then. So you see not only one bulletproof tax that goes straight away, like kind of like a tax twist, but rather a little sequence of small policy taxes that just evolve and also kind of adapt to the cultural perception of these taxes.
Great. I like the notion of the coronavirus tax. We could use that as a blanket for all sorts of taxes, I suppose. Katja.
Yeah, good. I have here a question that's following the thought from the discussion on the state. And this is for Stefania. Isn't the defining of what care is and what it isn't by the state very risky regarding the state oppression and control? Doesn't universal basic income do a better job in valuing care without creating this control and oppression?
Well, thank you for the question. The short answer is no, I think it doesn't, because for two reasons. First of all, because universal basic income is not the same as care income. Let me be clear here. I don't think that I'm not against universal basic income. In fact, I have also supported the campaign in Italy because I think that these I thought it was absolutely necessary, especially at the point in which the campaign was launched during the pandemic and as related to the quarantine and economic effects. So I do think that a universal basic income would be a way of addressing important issues socially. But calling this a care income campaign, it's wrong, because universal basic income recognizes a universal human right, the right to have a decent life, to be to reproduce ourselves away from free from blackmailing, for example, free from the jobs blackmail, and so it will give us the possibility of surviving and having a decent life without having to accept dangerous jobs, dirty jobs, and jobs that hurt the environment. And this is also one of the reasons why universal basic income has been also part of the degrowth conversation so far. But calling this care income is inappropriate, because care income is the recognition of that particular kind of work and activities that certain people, and not all people, that certain people do, that fall upon certain people more heavily heavily, unequally, and it's a way of recognizing these as essential and also, I would say essential to social and environmental well-being. So I think that one thing that we're having this conversation in Italy, where I have been launching the Care Income campaign in the last 2 months. And one thing that I have said is that this is my opinion. Of course, it can be discussed, but in my opinion, a care income should be additional with respect to a universal basic income. So it should recognize difference between people, difference between those who actually do the care work and those who, for example, who are able to afford to buy it, or those who can delegate it to other people, and those who are the people to which care is actually delegated to. And also, this is to respond to another critique that is related to this. Wouldn't the care income be reinforced existing inequalities? No, it wouldn't, because once this unpaid care work becomes paid, this is an important way for allowing everybody, and not just the women and the marginal people in society, but just everybody, to perform this work because it is dignified and paid as any other work, and actually more important than other work. So one important point of the Care Income campaign is that paying for care work is a way for making sure that it is more equally distributed across genders.
Thank you, Stefania. Ricardo, would you agree with that take on the universal basic income approach?
Yes, I agree. It's something that I think is very important to, and I think it goes back to the call we were making at the beginning, to really try now to do our homeworks and really think how to implement this in the details. And so the idea of having basic income, different types of it, and how integrate with each other, and how part of it, for example, can be given out in a local currency, how much of it instead can be done can be given out in a national currency, how much of it instead can be given out as a social wage, for example, through universal basic services, is exactly the kind of nuances that we need to advance the discourse. Because if we just stand on our preferred policies without looking at their integration, I think that there is the risk we just stall and never advance towards a shared common narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I have one more question from our audience, and maybe Tim can answer this one. As we need money to meet our needs and wage labor to get money, it seems that we have to be able to meet needs with non-market mechanisms before work can really change.
Yes, that's a good point. So when we're thinking with reforming the economy, I always like to think, like, if you take down one institution, you need to replace it with another one. So that's the theory. You have the two ends. And in the transition, you need to make sure that actually, as this one is going down, this one is going up, and you have a smooth transfer. So I give you an example now. We live in a commodified society. If you want a house, if you want food, if you want transport, you need general purpose currency. And the way to get that is wage labor. That's the start. That's the game we play today. If we were to introduce, let's say, an autonomy allowance in the style, of the unconditional autonomy allowance that Vincent Liéger and his friends proposed back in 2013, you could have it like, you would start, most of the autonomy allowance would be given in national currency. You would receive it in euro, like let's say maybe 80% of it. And the remaining would be in local currency as a way to stimulate the non-market economy. Maybe one part would be in free public services, the one that are easy to nationalize or to communalize. But as you go through the transition, you can slowly decrease. And this is where we see degrowth in the sense of a decommodification of social relation, as a shrinking of the monetary economy. The autonomy allowance, the part in euro would get smaller and smaller, and the part on free public services and local currency would get bigger, and you would get to the transition. And at every single moment, we need to ask ourselves as economists, that we all are, how do we provide for our needs? That should be the question. There cannot be any gap at the moment, as we transition, we will not be able to provide for our needs. No, we will always need to do this, but as we also discussed, we need to redefine what our needs are. And that also in collectively and democratically discussing, what the content of that autonomy allowance, we could actually use this as an opportunity to define, make the difference between necessities and luxuries, and specify what a frugal living lifestyle is.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm going to pick up on the notion of necessities and combine it with the idea of limits, which is also very central in degrowth, because one necessity is the limit of time. So I'm going to start wrapping up the discussion, even though we could surely discuss forever, and it's been really exciting. But just before we close up, I'd like to give each of our speakers the chance for a quick closing remark. And in your closing remarks, I'd like you to address one more question with a sort of, hopefully sort of end on a high note, on a positive note. And that's with a view to a brighter future, what's the most exciting development you see in the world these days? And what gives you hope? And in particular, what's your hope for the next few months? Stefania, do you want to start?
Well, thanks, but it's hard to talk about hope in a time of a global pandemic. So, I don't want to sound like naive by saying things that, but I think that something that has given not only myself, but many people hope has been the solidarity response on the part of many people to this crisis, and how many have contrasted the state policies and trying to really come to help others, because I think this has to do with an awareness that has become really, really widespread during the pandemic, of the fact that the current system values the economy in the sense that it values profits and money more than lives. And so this has become very clear to a lot of people. So this gives me hope, because I think that cultural change is very key to, at least in democratic societies, it's really key to any possible transformation.
Thank you, Stefania. Ricardo, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I would have liked to stress what Stefania has just said, and I'll pick maybe my second choice then, which is, I think, the realization that so many of us have had over the last month of how our hyper-connected supply chains that are super efficient with no redundancy makes them vulnerable. And people have, for the first time, realized that most of their stuff just comes from so far away. And the moment in which this hyper-connectedness comes down, we are really left vulnerable. And so I think that there has been a revival of attention for local food production. And I know that one of the few activities that have increased over the lockdown period is local food production, because people all of a sudden needed to have the safety net on one of the most essential goods, which is food. And I really hope that this will remain a lesson, and this will be something that all of us will be willing to engage more with the local production and the surroundings of our city, and start thinking in terms of the closer it comes, to me, the easier it is to ensure its sustainability, its resilience, and I can directly engage with it. And so I think this brings me back to the neighborhood solidarity also that Stefania stressed.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. And Tim, I guess you will now have to fall back on your third choice. Tim, please.
I've been tracking the way the word degrowth has been mobilized in the news since the beginning of the pandemic. And I've been analyzing about 90 articles that have been written about degrowth. That is a lot. I've also done it before and I can compare, that is a lot. So I think we are living through a red pill moment. You remember the Matrix? Morpheus proposes to Neo, blue pill, red pill. And the fact of saying degrowth being so much mobilized and so many people getting interested about degrowth, for me, is showing that there's more and more red pills out there. So that is something that gives me optimism that maybe this decolonization of the social imaginary we've been talking about for a while is somehow underway. And I also really much enjoy sitting on the grass and watching the sky without planes. That is also very nice.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeffen, it's been wonderful moderating this talk with you. And I guess both of us can agree that we had an exceptional conversation tonight. And I hope all of you watching this tonight have also learned something new, as I have, and are excited to share these new insights with your friends and family, especially about the Green New Deal for Europe and the insights on the degrowth that have emerged tonight. A big thank you for all our inspiring speakers. Thank you for your thoughts and for making the time to contribute to the series.
Thank you.
And thanks also, thank you. Thanks also for the all-important off-screen team. So you were invaluable. And all the other members of the organizing group. And before we end tonight, I want to remind you that this is not the end of the degrowth talks. We have more talks lined up with a fantastic program awaiting for you until the end of June. And so please join us again next week to listen Doing Business in Degrowth Economy, Theory and Practice with Ollie Sylvester, Bradley, and Julie Score and Ashish Kotari. So next week talk will be half an hour earlier than the discussion tonight, already at 5:30 UK time. So do not be late. Thanks again and good night, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be here with you tonight.